When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
And welcome to You and the Law, presented by the Chicago Bar Association. I'm Max Barrick. I'm a partner and head of litigation at the Garfinkel Group, a plaintiff-side labor and employment firm. And I am very excited today as we are joined by Rachel Weissberg and Leslie Markman-Stern. Today, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, how it's relevant or how it affects returning to the workplace as people get back going into the office, into where they work. People working from home, how that might function moving forward in the future, how to make workplaces safer from a COVID perspective, and just generally having more safe and accessible and productive workplaces. Let me start with Rachel. Rachel, welcome. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Max. Thanks so much for having me. Of course, I'm Rachel Weissberg. I am a supervising attorney with Equip for Equality. Equip for Equality is a nonprofit organization that provides free legal services to people with disabilities on issues related to their disability in Illinois. And I oversee some of our civil rights team and represent clients on all sorts of different types of ADA cases, including employment, folks who have employment-related disability issues. I also manage Equip for Equality's Employment Rights Helpline, which provides free legal information to job seekers and employees with disabilities in Illinois. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Rachel. That was great. And Leslie, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Leslie Markman-Stern. I'm an interior designer, and I own a commercial and residential interior design firm. One of my specialties is designing for the disabled and senior populations. I'm also a frequent speaker on the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, and how to integrate it, the requirements into public and private spaces for greater accessibility for all generations and needs. And thank you for having me today.
Thanks for being here, Leslie. So Rachel, let me start off with you, since you're our ADA guru. Can you just explain very briefly for the audience, what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? What is the ADA?
Sure. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal anti-discrimination law. It was passed by Congress in 1990 with the mandate of ensuring equal opportunity and non-discrimination for people with disabilities. It's a really broad law. It covers all sorts of different types of situations. But I know today we're going to focus on a part of the law called Title I, which is the employment discrimination protections of the ADA. And in some ways, the ADA is like any other anti-discrimination law. It says we can't treat people unfairly based on their disability. But in other ways, the ADA recognizes that sometimes we need to do something a little bit different, a little bit affirmative to make sure that we're providing equal opportunities. And so based on that concept, the ADA has this really important requirement called the reasonable accommodation requirement, which I know we'll dig into a little bit more.
So why don't you sort of explain what that means? What is a reasonable accommodation? How does somebody get one? How do they ask for one?
Sure. So a reasonable accommodation is really any change in the application process to the way that we do our job or the physical landscape of our job to make sure that we're providing applicants and employees with disabilities equal opportunities. Really, a reasonable accommodation can be almost anything. And the way that it works is that somebody with a disability usually is the one who reaches out to their employer and says, you know, hey, I have a disability or a medical condition and I need some change or some adjustment to the way that my job is done. And it's as simple as that. It's really clear. Although I, as a lawyer, always counsel my clients to make it very clear that, hey, I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. the law is really clear that all an employee needs to do is to ask for some change to the workplace based on some disability or medical reason. And that's enough to trigger the requirement that an employer start to have an interactive process and discuss with the employee what might be a possible accommodation.
So that's great, Rachel. So then let's take that a little further. Let's talk about how the ADA, what the ADA has to do with COVID. And then we can talk about, some examples of COVID-related ADA accommodations you might see people from time to time.
Of course. And, the ADA covers all parts of our lives, right? And COVID is impacting all parts of our lives. And so I think it's not surprising that there's been so many really important and interesting conversations about how does the ADA impact people during the COVID pandemic. So just to throw out I could talk about this for hours, but just to throw out a couple thoughts. So question number one is, who's protected by the ADA? Well, we know that the ADA protects people who have disabilities, there's a very specific definition. And so one question that we've been always trying to figure out is, okay, well, if somebody has a pre-existing condition that puts them at a higher risk of developing severe complications from COVID, does the ADA protect them? And so far, courts are pretty unanimously saying, yes, absolutely. That's someone that's protected by the law. Another question is, well, what about people who develop COVID itself? Is that an ADA qualifying disability? And what about people who are what we are now calling people who have long COVID or COVID long haulers? And we're seeing more and more courts starting to look at these questions, and the court decisions that we've seen so far have said, yes, so long as somebody has a substantial limitation that's coming from that COVID diagnosis or that long COVID diagnosis, they can be protected by the law as well. And so what does that mean? What does that mean if you're protected by the law? Kind of circling back to our reasonable accommodation request. Well, again, reasonable accommodations can be anything, right? So we're seeing all sorts of different accommodations that are being requested as a way to make sure people are protecting their health and safety as a result of COVID. So it could be something as simple as restructuring the office environment, making sure that there's sufficient space between, employees or patients or customers. It's kind of a concept, right, that could really apply to anyone, but it also can help people with disabilities. Other accommodations might be restructuring a job so that anything that somebody needs that they're not able to do because of COVID, maybe that part of their job could be restructured. Two accommodations that we're seeing all the time are the questions of telework as a reasonable accommodation. So of course, right, there's so many people who started working from home during the pandemic, and all of a sudden, people are starting to come back to work. So the question that we're faced with a lot is, can those individuals remain working from home as a reasonable accommodation? Reassignment to another job, perhaps one that's better suited for telework or better suited for social distancing, is another common accommodation that we're seeing as a result of COVID. So again, it can be any of these things. And so what's really important in the ADA is to have an interactive process between the employee and the employer to find out what's going to work for the employee and what's workable for the employer as well.
So that's really informative and helpful. Thank you, Rachel. And actually, that gives us a really good transition, Leslie, because we're going to go from Rachel, who works with employees, to Leslie, who tends to work with companies. So Leslie, thinking about, some of what Rachel said, how are companies rethinking office design? You heard Rachel mention a few examples of how workspaces may be different. So let's talk turkey. What are we actually seeing in the workplace right now? What kind of changes are happening?
So we do see people now, they're bringing their businesses back, they're bringing their employees back. And how do you make this safe? So we wanted to bring them back. We're using a lot more outdoor spaces because of air quality. People want to be healthier. And where we are in North America, that's only good for maybe 4 or 5 months. We are also thinking about materials, and it's not these plastic screens that you're seeing all over. I don't necessarily agree that they're really protecting us, but are materials cleaner? Are we thinking of ways that are bacteria free? Are we using hands free? So if you go in to use a public bathroom, or if you're working on a medical dental office, how do we use it so hands free? Maybe we're using a foot pedal. So we're trying to avoid contamination. We're doing downsizing. You're seeing more businesses that are consolidating because more employees are working from home, which we'll talk about later, but the spaces are smaller. But then we still want to bring people back in the conference room, so we're separating them. Maybe bringing a few in at a time, not everybody at the same time. Maybe somebody's on Zoom from their brick and mortar office, while others are in the conference room. We're thinking about the air quality. We're using better filtration systems with ionization to keep it cleaner. And we're thinking about, people are thinking about their employees. You know, what can I do to make this space more accessible for somebody who does have a disability? They're rethinking that. I'm hearing more of those questions coming up now than in the past. So they're rethinking the space so that it is more accommodating, healthier, and more attractive. So people will want to come back and work there. Where I think in the past, they may have interfered with their working environment because it wasn't so clean.
So there's a term I've heard used a couple of times, and maybe it's something you could help us define, Leslie. I've heard this term universal design thrown around a few times, not today necessarily, but in life, when referring to how workplaces are being redesigned. Can you explain what that means to us and how that's involved with what we're talking about today?
Sure. So universal design is defined as the design of buildings, products, or environments to make them accessible to all people, regardless of their age, their disability, or any other factors. It could be somebody with Parkinson's, but it could also be somebody who has a back issue. It could be, extreme, and any age. We're seeing people working in law firms at a much later age now. And how do you accommodate for people who, are seniors, are working there? And there are 7 principles of interior design that we follow. And I would like to just quickly go over those because they're important. We want to make sure with universal design, the space is useful, it's equal. It's useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. That means it's marketable to all people. And it's safe. It's flexible. It accommodates all individual preferences and buildings, such as tools that allow for even being right-handed or left-handed. Being able level changes allow for wheelchairs. The third one that is involved is that it is simple and intuitive, easy to understand and operate, allow for different literacy levels and language abilities. Fourth, it uses perceptible information. This design makes it easy to provide pictorial, verbal, and tactile directions to communicate information effectively to the user, regardless of ambient conditions or sensory abilities. Now, this may apply to someone who is visually impaired or hearing impaired, like if you're using Braille or you're using sign language. It minimizes risk in accidents. The design minimizes hazards and risks of accidental or unintended actions by arranging commonly used elements in the most accessible locations and hazardous elements, either removed or shielded. You want to, like, if somebody is going up, wants to get into a building, they may need an accessible ramp. Rather, they can't take the stairs. It requires low physical effort. The design can be used efficiently and comfortably with little effort or fatigue. And lastly, it's appropriately sized and spaced. The design incorporates enough size and space for approaching, reaching, manipulating, and using, regardless of body size, posture, or mobility. So what are some examples of this are? If somebody is trying to get into their office and they're in a wheelchair and the doorway is only 30 inches, you want to accommodate for wheelchair use. If somebody is hearing impaired and they're in a building, how are they going to know that there is a fire alarm going off? So you have to deliver that message with something other than sound. Or somebody is visually impaired and they're going up to an elevator. How are they going to get into know to what number to press. It's going to be in Braille. So those are just a few examples. But we want to make sure that this building accommodates them. And as Rachel mentioned, we use the least amount of accommodations when it's necessary.
That sounds like a really good concept, and the kind of thing that maybe is one of the positives to the pandemic, right? Is that maybe more businesses are going to start transitioning to have more accessible spaces for people. Let's switch gears again a little bit and talk about a topic you both mentioned, working from home. So one of the changes, obviously, we've seen in the pandemic is we've learned, or maybe we already knew, but now people are admitting that not every job needs to be done physically in the office. Rachel, can you talk a little bit about whether working from home, I know you mentioned it earlier, so let's dive into it. Is that a disability accommodation people can ask for? And if it is, what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And, those of us in the disability rights community, there's been a lot of real hardships on our community over the pandemic. But I think that the possibility of telework as an accommodation in the future is one of the silver linings of the past 18 months. So to answer your question, Max, yes, telework can be a reasonable accommodation. Everything with the ADA is very individualized and very case by case and requires a fact-intensive inquiry. Why? Because what somebody needs for one disability is not going to be the same as what someone else needs for a different disability, or maybe even the same disability. Similarly, what's reasonable for one job is not going to be reasonable for another job. I, as a lawyer, can do almost all of the parts of my job from home, right? But if I was working as a server in a restaurant, well, no, that's not reasonable, right? So whenever we're deciding whether or not any particular accommodation is reasonable, we look to a number of different factors, including whether you're able to perform the essential functions or really the key parts of your job from home. I think what we've learned over the pandemic is that this is doable, right? Even if it takes a little bit of creative thought, even if it takes a little bit of problem solving, most people have jobs, or many people have jobs that can certainly be done at home. Before the pandemic, I'll say there has been a number of court cases that have really questioned whether telework is a viable, reasonable accommodation. And we're starting to see more and more cases look at this again in the context of COVID. And so I can't tell you today what the judicial landscape is going to look like, but I'm pretty optimistic that now that everyone has seen, yes, again, with some thought, with some problem solving, we can make this happen. It's going to really benefit people with disabilities who need to work from home for disability related reasons.
Are there any examples you can give, Rachel? I know we've talked a little bit about some conditions that maybe your boss didn't need to know about before, your employer, and now because of COVID, you're high risk and we need to talk about it. Can you give some examples of maybe court decisions, or of, obviously I don't want you to get any violate confidentiality or privilege, but any hypothetical client examples you've seen also?
Yeah, of course. So actually the very first COVID related ADA case was about telework. So not surprising. It was a case that came out of Massachusetts. It was on behalf of somebody who had asthma, right? And so asthma is one of these conditions that have been specified by the CDC as something that puts you at an increased risk of severe complications if you acquire it. And so this individual had been working from home, just like many people. In March 2020, the shutdown happened. This individual started working from home. And then a couple of months later, what happened is something that I've seen happen with a lot of my clients too. The employer just kind of said universally, okay, everyone's coming back. And this person went, again, they had asthma. They probably had never had any reason to disclose that to their employer in the past, but said, I'm really terrified of coming back. And this was, again, pre-vaccines. We're in a little bit of a different landscape because this was last summer. And they said, look, I've been able to do all of my job from home for the last 3 months. And the employer did what I would encourage employers not to do, which is just to say, too bad, everyone needs to come back. We're not going to look at this individually. And what really kind of got this employer in trouble was that the employer was permitting other people to work from home if they had non-disability related issues. So childcare, for instance. A lot of managers who are in the same exact position as this individual were permitted to telework. So this individual brought a preliminary injunction under state law and the ADA. That's not something we see a lot in the employment world. So it was kind of interesting to see how that played out. And the court granted the preliminary injunction, said this individual has to be allowed to telework. And soon after that, the case settled. So first example, I expect to see many more of those types of situations moving forward. One thing I just wanted to add is I think what comes to our mind initially when we think of the need to telework are things like asthma, things that put us at an increased risk of acquiring COVID or the severe complications if we get it. You know, one population that I've seen just really benefit from telework are a lot of people who have mental health disabilities. I've had a lot of clients that said, you know, I was able to push through. I was able to get to work. I was able to do my job, but I am thriving now that I'm home. I'm thriving now that I can work from home on occasion when I need to. And that certainly is a disability under the ADA. That's certainly a reason to telework under the ADA. And so it's important that we think of disability broadly and accommodations broadly.
That's a really good point, Rachel. Thank you for raising that, because we think about the ADA and disabilities and maybe people who are visually impaired or hearing impaired or use a wheelchair to get around maybe comes to mind. And we often forget about mental health and how important that is and how that can be a condition you struggle with as well. And that sometimes requires accommodation. So it's really good you brought attention to that.
Absolutely. And I mean, and maybe that's another silver lining of the pandemic. I think we all are starting to understand mental health a little bit more, as a lot of us have struggled, right, over the last 18 months with this change and isolation.
What are you talking about? I'm thrilled to be staring at the same four walls I was 20 months ago. Leslie, let me turn to you and let's stay with working from home. Are there any recommendations or changes you're seeing or things you might suggest to people if your situation has changed? Maybe you've set up a new business, maybe you're at the same job and you're just changing your circumstance. Now you're a work from home person. What are you seeing? What do you recommend?
So what I've been seeing is in the beginning of COVID, a lot of people were working from home. They were sitting on their dining room chair, staring into their monitor. There was no other lights on, and you could hear the echo because they had hard surfaces or windows. And they didn't really project themselves as well as they could through the screen. First of all, if they had the same chair that they had in their brick and mortar that was ergonomic, which is better for their back and neck, and that would make them more comfortable. If they had other lights on in the room, they could see better. They wouldn't be tiring out their eyes. And if they had a little area rug on their floor or even put up a canvas painting, it would absorb the noise and you wouldn't hear the echoing on a Zoom call. All those can be done successfully and they don't have to be costly. What else I'm seeing is, well, you brought one up, Rachel brought up mental health. And I think it's very important for mindfulness that we should be working on that, even if you are working from home. You know, sitting in your chair for 8 hours staring at the screen doesn't necessarily make you productive all 8 hours. Get up, move around, take a walk. That's good for movement. Think about something, go and meditate, do some yoga for a few minutes, take a break. All good things. Biophilic. Looking out at green really helps us with mindfulness, makes us feel better. We've always been attracted to nature since the beginning of mankind. So if you can't look at nature by looking out a window, put a small plant in your room. That will all help. And all these things can be helpful, make you more productive and feel better during the day. You can get a little ionization machine to clean the air in your office, your home office. You can open a window. Pick healthy food. All these things will make us more productive, feel better, and not just have us glued to our chairs staring at the screen.
It's almost like you do this for a living, Leslie. Those are really good tips. We're a little bit short on time, but I want to stay with you, Leslie. Are there any takeaways or challenges people ought to think about or be aware of that you're seeing now or you think are going to continue into next year that maybe we didn't have a year ago or before that?
I'm glad you asked. There are supply chain issues right now. We cannot get the materials like we used to before COVID. There are not enough people in the factories. Trying to get materials from overseas is a problem. You have all the ships that are all lined up on the Pacific, and there's not enough people to offload the materials. You don't have enough truck drivers to drive the materials, and the cost of goods and the transportation are all going up. And I think this is going to continue into 2022.
Yeah, I think everybody's hearing a lot about supply chain issues, so that's a really good point and suggestion. Rachel, let's turn to you. Before we go, can you share with us a little bit more about Equip for Equality generally and how people can either get help from EFE or can help the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, Equip for Equality is a statewide disability rights organization. We represent people and provide free legal services on issues related to people's disability. To kind of plug, especially the Employment Rights Helpline. These are, the Employment Rights Helpline provides answers. We try to do behind the scenes legal assistance for people who have any disability related questions about their employment, and really no questions are too small. So if you're an employee with a disability and you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I request an accommodation? Or do I need to tell my employer about my disability? Or really struggling at work, I wonder if there's something that might help me. Please reach out to us. You can contact us directly at 1-844-RIGHTS-9. You can email us at employment@equipforequality.org, or just Google Equip for Equality, contact us anyway, it will get routed to us. And again, I think in the employment world, being an employee and be able to just kind of brainstorm employment situations before there's like a real legal ADA issue is always the best thing, right? Because our goal is to keep people employed and get the accommodations and other things that they need to do your job effectively.
Awesome. And if anybody wants to volunteer with Equip for Equality, is that an option as well?
Yeah, it definitely is. So both the Employment Rights Helpline and actually our Special Education Helpline, we both rely on pro bono volunteers to help us with initial client interviews. And there's a whole host of other volunteer opportunities. So they're all on our website, or anyone, I might regret saying this, but anyone can feel free to reach out to me directly and I will either chat with you or route you to the right person.
All right, you heard it, Rachel. Rachel's asking for it, right to her. Just kidding, of course. I want to thank both Leslie and Rachel for coming on today. You both gave us a lot of really wonderful and important information, have given some really good guidance and suggestions and just ideas to people on how to continue to navigate this really hard time and stay safe, both working from home and going back into the workplace. We really appreciate you giving us your time and expertise. This has been You in the Law by the Chicago Bar Association. Thank you so much for watching.
When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.